Whitney Museum. I'm a volunteer docent, and my name's Gina. And I want to especially welcome you to this exhibition, which is the collection of Thea Westrite Wagner and Ethan Wagner. And it's really a transformative donation gift that they have given to the Whitney Museum. They gifted more than 850 works of art from their collection. Over 500 of those works of art came here to the Whitney because they are American artists. Of course, we're the Whitney Museum of American Art. And the remaining 350 they gifted to the Pompidou, Centre Pompidou in Paris for the European artists. So really a transformative gift of works of art from the last 25 years, sort of starting in the 80s up to the present. And the collectors have always been interested, and even to this day, and Thea Westrite Wagner was actually on the floor today with her family walking around, and they were actually also the day after Christmas when I gave a tour that day, they were on the floor with all their family. So they, of course, really love this art, and what they love is collecting contemporary art. Every work here, the collectors actually went into the artist's studio and talked to the artist and collected it as it was being made. So they are very interested in emerging young artists and the contemporary art. So, sure. We'll start with this piece here, Ascending Sink by Robert Gober, which he created in 1985. So you think the collectors walk into the studio, Gober's just 31 years old, and they'll look at this and they see these sinks on the wall, and of course their art history knowledge, they'll think right away, sort of must reference Marcel Duchamp's The Fountain, where Marcel Duchamp went into a hardware store and just purchased a ceramic urinal, turned it upside down, and went to a gallery and said, "This is art," and sort of really negating the artist's hand, and really what the artist really does is have an idea. And so here, using these sinks, Gober's really referencing, having an art historical reference to that. And in addition, at this time in the 80s, there was the minimalist sculpture like Donald Judd, who would have his specific objects, these boxes, which he would go up the wall and be his sculpture. So he's referencing that to the minimalist sculpture. And so the artists are always very interested in art history. I mean, almost every art actually references art history. They learn about it. But also in Gober's work, he's referencing the time of what's going on at the day in the 80s. And in 85, it was the peak of the AIDS epidemic. And actually, Ronald Reagan didn't even mention the word AIDS until 2 years later in 1987. So around Robert Gober and his contemporaries, people were just dying, and people didn't know what was causing it. And so these sinks really sort of have this cold, clinical feeling of hygiene, washing and washing, and one sink's not even enough. You need two sinks, like just cleanliness and hygiene, and a real obsession with that. In addition, they can reference the human body, where the faucets would go could be like two eyes, and then the drain is like things just really minimize the human body like that. And then Gober, what's interesting is that Marcel Duchamp went to the hardware store and purchased his artwork. Here, Gober's referencing that, but he carefully, lovingly handmade these sinks. These exactly looks like a sink that was in his studio, but he remade them himself by hand. You can still even see his handiwork on it. And so these were carefully made sculptures by hand. And he was telling the collectors that he thought that an interesting way to present them, not only on the wall, but maybe outside, they could be sculpture outside where they'd actually would be buried in a lawn. And then it really would reference sort of like a tombstone there. And he thought it could be laid out like as if a headboard for a twin bed, like a bed in the hospital or in a nursing home. And he said also that the title, Ascending Sink, it's not plural, it's just one sink. So ascending sink is that like sending up to heaven. And so it really has all these very layered references in this piece here, and you can see why the collectors were so taken with it and purchased it when Gober was just 31 years old, at the beginning of his career. And they, of course, were very pleased that just last year Robert Gober had a 40-year retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art of all of his works. Of course, he went on to have a very successful career. And also Gober, probably very gratified that the scientific community has come through. And the diagnosis of HIV positive or AIDS is not a death sentence anymore, but it can be a chronic disease. So here Gober is addressing Marcel Duchamp and his ready-made so far, like just like an artist selecting something and declaring it as art. But he actually made these by hand. The next piece we'll see is a true ready-made. So this here is a work by Jan Bo, D-A-N-H, Bo. The D is pronounced like Y in Vietnamese. He was born in Vietnam. The title of it is 4:32 p.m., May 26, 2009. And actually the real title is in the European mode, 14:32, 26/5, 2009. And that represents the moment that this chandelier was removed from the Majestic Hotel in Paris. They were restoring that hotel, and Jan Bo heard about that, and he knew that that was where the Vietnam Peace Accord talks were taking place, and the peace accord was signed in 1973. And being from Vietnam, that meant so much to him that these chandeliers were witness to those 5 years of North Vietnam, South Vietnam, France, and the U.S. trying to pounding out this deal to stop the fighting in Vietnam, and they signed the peace accord in 1973 underneath this chandelier and two others. But then immediately it was revoked and fighting started again. And so since that happened, Jan Bo was born into a country of war 2 years later, and he lived on a refugee island that was outside of Vietnam with his parents. And after 4 years, his father and some other men built a boat, and they went out to sea to escape. It's so timely. And a Danish tanker actually found them and took them to Denmark. And that is where Jan Bo grew up, and he's now a Danish citizen. And he really says there's something about citizenship that it can be so random. And he is so obsessed with his birth country that all of his work has threads of that through it. And for example, he was interested in the personal effects of the Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, who was doing that. That went on for auction by his estate, and he collected that. So he has this sort of obsession with that thread through his work, that personal and art historical reference, and the historical reference. And all of his work is ready-mades like this, that even though he's trained as an artist, his work is, his collector, the gallery owner that represents him, says he's a hunter and gatherer, that he's always out there looking for things. And this work here, when it was first presented, it was laid out on the floor in a gallery, just how it had been taken apart. They just laid it out on the floor. And another time it was displayed in a gallery, it was actually put in a cage and sort of sitting on the floor there on the cage. But I think it's so effective how they actually hung it up. The curators decided to hang it up as a chandelier, because here it sort of has this weight of what it witnessed hanging over our heads. It's sort of casting like this long shadow, and it seems just really effective. So Jan Bo he was just 34 years old when he did that, so this wasn't that long ago. So he's still in, I think, late 30s. He last year represented Denmark at the 2015 Venice Biennale, which is every 2 years in Venice they have the most contemporary of art, and countries send what they want to represent for their whole country. So he represented Denmark. And his piece was called Mother Tongue, and was installation. So he still, his works have that thread of his origins in Vietnam. And he has another work that he did in the last few years referencing people's origins. It was the Statue of Liberty, he got French manufacturers, the same place that made the real Statue of Liberty in copper, had a complete replicate made of it, completely, the whole thing made again in copper. And he did not put it together. He had all the different pieces, and he spread it out around the world. And the title of it is We the People. So it's like we all come, from everyone's origins, but, it sort of really depends, like what is your citizenship? What does that all mean? What is your origin of country? So he really brings such a personal effect into his work. And pretty amazing, a refugee coming on a boat, and here he is represented Denmark at the Venice Biennale. So, yeah, it's really something. And his parents actually ran a little hamburger shop in Denmark the whole time, just to, like he called it, I can't even remember the word, but it wasn't very nice. But, just hard working, and here he loved to be like the renowned artist. Yeah, I know. You walk into a museum and go, okay, well, this is art. I recognize this. This is a painting. This was done by Laura Owens when she was just 28 years old. And 1998. Untitled. And she went to the Rhode Island School of Design and had a really rigorous training in drawing. Then she went to the Art Institute of California for her master's degree, where she decided she wanted to do painting. And at that time in the 90s, to do painting was like to be rebellious. No one was doing painting. And so that was just for her to assert herself and do like a real painting, really was an act of rebellion, it said. But here she has this very large canvas, and what she uses here for her drawing is a space pen. It's the same kind of pen that the astronauts take up to space, so they could, with no gravity, so they can write with in no gravity. So here she could freely use her hand and have the mark be equal everywhere. And she did this the long way, because she had it taken in her studio when she did it. And here she has really no reference here to personal history or to what's going on in the late 90s. It's just really only a reference to art historical reference. She's referencing here this all over paintings of the abstract expressionists, where like every part could be equal. And painting was really like always sort of being declared dead. I mean, back in the beginning of the 1800s, when photography was discovered, all of a sudden, well, why would you ever do painting? We have photography. And then, of course, when Marcel Duchamp is declaring it's just the idea, it's nothing to do with the artist's hand, then again, okay, painting's dead. And then the abstract expressionists, well, the canvas is a place to show an event. It's an action. It's showing the event of the painter. And sort of on and on. It's always sort of fighting to find, artists are fighting to find where they can make painting relevant. So here she did this all over painting, and then she's filling in with this sort of thin acrylic paint, sort of like referencing like Helen Frankenthaler, which you can see upstairs in the collection, and our Jackson Pollock upstairs. And of course the pastel colors, sort of asserting herself as a woman, like it looks like feminine colors. And the fact that she would sign it up there, it's paint right out of a tube. So it's like her signature, I am declaring I am a painter. And then her decision, she wanted it hung this way, upside down, really declaring any place is equal. There, it's an all-over painting here. So she's just 28 years old here, and the collectors, liked her work, and she's gone on to be a really influential. She's a mid-career painter right now, and she was in the Whitney Biennial, and just the last one, 2014. And actually, a reason that the collectors selected the Whitney Museum is, the mission of this museum is to support emerging American artists, young American artists. And one of the ways we continue that mission of the founder, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, that was her mission, is by the biennial every 2 years, opening up the museum for young artists. So it was really a good fit for the collectors to gift their collection to this museum. So we'll continue looking at painting. So this is a work by Christopher Wall, which he did when he was 35 years old, 1990 to 1991. At the time when he painted this, he had not painted anything for 3 years, because like other artists at this time, he was really grappling with what kind of art he wanted to create. Did he want to do painting? Did he want to have paint on a canvas that's hanging on a wall, oil paint on a canvas hanging on a wall, flat? So he was grappling with that. He was living down in the East Village in New York, and he was looking around down there, and he would see signs, post no bills, no trespassing, these sort of illuminated signs. Then he saw a brand new delivery truck that had graffiti on it, said Sex Love, SEXLUV. And that just sort of inspired him, as if that side of that truck was a canvas and the letters could be objects and images for a painting. So that's where he got started with these paintings, his word paintings. And this canvas here actually is aluminum. And you can see it on the top here where it's exposed. That's just straight the stencil right onto the aluminum up there. But what he's done here, he first did a phrase underneath here. And then he painted it over, you can see down here, with white. And then he re-stenciled the phrase on top of it. So in doing this, first of all, he's sort of referencing Jasper Johns, who was using the stencils after the abstract expressionists, really like getting away from that such emotional expressiveness of those painters and having a more control. It's just having stencils to control the mark there. And he's like even Jasper Johns, like White Target, his white paintings too, like where it's like painted over like that. But here, there's really a painterliness about this though, too. It's not just the straight stencils that you see on top there. You can see down here the dripping, and so Wool is really combining sort of the stenciling, but with really a painterly feel to it, and really showing that, this is really a painting. And the phrase that he uses here is sort of a classic phrase that's used by, I can never say this, nihilism, there you go. Nihilism, the nihilist phrase that life has no meaning, there's no meaning in life. And the phrase is, and here he, of course, has no spaces, no punctuation, so it slows you down reading it. The show is over. The audience get up to leave their seats. Time to collect their coats and go home. They turn around and no more coats and no more home. So it's sort of like, again, untitled. You notice these are all untitled. Untitled 1997. And he too, of course, grappling with what to paint. How am I going to make a painting? And he, unlike the artists that we've seen so far, did not have success. But the collectors were intrigued by his work, and he was a real artist. Like, artists really admired him. He would have an exhibition. In fact, for his whole career, he only sold 2 paintings under $10,000. And this actually was painted in, when he was 37 years old, and when he was 47 years old, he died on a motorcycle accident. And he was, but each of his exhibitions, he would have these kind of paintings. Actually, underneath here, these monochromatic paintings that would be loose on the stretchers here like this. Like he's really just tacking paintings and just, you know, making a joke of the flatness of the painting here, you know, and like really twisting and turning and really jostling with what he's going to be painting there. So he'd have an exhibition and nothing would sell, and the gallery owner would go, well, sorry, nothing sold. And he's oh God, goes in there, he'd get them, and he would paint over them with this black enamel like this. And he said, I am like negating the fact that canvases, paintings can have this ascending value over time. I'm just not going to let that happen because I'm just painting over the same canvases. But then it was just sort of a shame because he really didn't sell any, so it didn't really apply in his case. But he just really, you can see how this beautiful sort of stain painting here and everything, and it's just sort of surprising it didn't take off in his lifetime. But, you know, after his motorcycle accident, all of a sudden there's so much interest about him, and the year after that, it was 2014 he died, 2005, the 2006 biennial. He was in the 2006 Whitney biennial, sort of caught to attention, and all of a sudden now his works are very valuable. But the collectors appreciated him, you know, back then. So we'll come around this way. This is a work by Matthias Fahlbacken, and it's untitled. And here we have these lockers, and like honestly, anyone from in high school or middle school, you just are so like you have your locker, and that's where you put all your stuff, and you're really, I mean, this really addresses the idea that individuality is just like prescribed into these little spaces, you know, and we really want to, so the fact that someone like crunched the lockers is just this visceral feeling. It takes you right back to high school. Oh my God. I mean, that's a pretty strong thing. And Fahlbacken, that's what he does use, these sort of everyday objects, which he does sort of this vandalism too. That's the kind of work he does, like attacking. But here it has that art historical reference too, where of course each of these could be like minimalist sculpture, you know, geometric, repeated objects, like a minimalist sculpture would be. And here he's just squeezing the air out of it, really, attacking that medium there. And these straps are, these colors of these straps are really his sort of signature look. Like once you see this, then you recognize his pieces. He always uses this. You can see these handles almost feels like you could like go in there and do what sort of invites you to join in the vandalism. But in reality, he has to use machines to squeeze it. And you know, there's really the artist's eye here too, because the fact that these are turned around and it's gray here just makes it a much more pleasing object, really, than if they were just all blue. And the colors here. And when he first showed this piece, it was in a gallery in Oslo, and they had these big windows with big orange frames around it. So you can just imagine how beautiful this piece looked in that gallery. So there's really this, you know, this artist's eye to this too, even though it has all this vandalism and feeling about that. So during this time, the 80s and 90s, artists, you know, sort of like Fahlbacken, were sort of like celebrities. They were doing stuff wasn't just like presenting their work. They were really part of their work and sort of promoting their work. This work here is called Talent, which was done in 1986 by David Robbins. He was just 29 years old when he created this piece. And he was addressing the fact that at the time it was like artists were really being sort of like celebrities. Like they were being promoted as celebrities in a sense. Like someone would want the work of so-and-so. And you just have to still keep in mind so much going on. Parallel, there's Robert Gober doing his piece all about the AIDS epidemic. So there's so many threads going on at that, of course, at all times. So here, David Robbins, here he is right here, at 29 years old. He asked all his artist friends, will they go to Times Square to a real place to get an 8x10 glossy photograph, like any actor or actresses, so you can go sell yourself, like here I am. And he said, don't tell them you're an artist, just say that you're like an actor or actress. Try to make it your best smile, like you're really like engaging and smile, and then bring them back to me, and then he would select the ones that he would do in this work, or he would set these up like you see in a restaurant even. And not every artist wanted to do this, but some were game. In fact, and this was a famous place, like where Frank Sinatra and the Supremes had their 8x10 glossies done. So it was like a really authentic 8x10 glossy here. So you can see, look at, there's Cindy Sherman. Everyone is like in their late 20s here. Jeff Koons, Jenny Holzer. It's funny, this one, Alan McCollum. Robin said that was when he was worried that he wouldn't like his pictures because they all sort of looked sort of like that, and then he didn't know how to present it to him that he would be able to include he really wanted to include him, so he decided he would tell him that, you know, I really like your photograph. I feel like you look like a really handsome but fearful man. and then Alan McCollum goes, well, I think that's true, and so then he was able to include that photo in it. You know, here is Stephen Carino, who we saw with the twisted painting, which, so at a young man, he's just in his early 20s, so even at that point, artists were aware of him, and that died in the accident, yep, so there he is, you know, an artist in this piece here. So Jeff Koons, of course, front and center, really, he embraced this celebrity. And tried to really make it work for him. It's called Poodle, and it's part of a series that is called Banality. And Jeff Koons always works in series, and in this series, he was sort of addressing how people were buying art just, you know, to decorate their home and like little kitsch. So he's sort of making fun of all that, and he made the series of these objects. And in the series was also the Michael Jackson and Bubbles. Anyone knows that object? And what he did is like, this would be like a real little kitschy thing made by the finest German artisans, woodworkers. And then for like that was woodwork. For the ones that were ceramic, they used this piece at resin. And here he makes this poodle here. And just like life-size though, that's the thing, sort of like a joke. And he had the artisan sign these pieces, which was just sort of really unusual. And in the art world, it sort of was like he was using them as performance art. So there was a little bit of you know, pushback on this series here that he did. But the next series, he thought, well, I'll make that because and then he married her. And he thought it was like love, and he would use her studio, her photographers, everybody, to make this film. And then he thought he'd take these beautiful stills from it, make, honestly, it's just like as big as that wall practically, stills from this film, and display it as art. So he had all these stills that he and his wife from this film that he was gallery in New York, displayed these all around it. Everyone was just like over the top, like, oh no, like just like he was like a pariah. He just pushed it too far, like he just went too far, and so he had to really walk back from all that. And then he got a divorce from the wife, and there's all this So he really, it's not a story to tell right now back, but he just really had his ups and downs with celebrity. Is that wood or stone? This one's wood. Really were like the agents and the advisors to these young artists, and really, almost maybe, abusing them, and and also in addition to supporting them. So this work, though, is addressing the fact that artists wanted to take more control of their own practice. So this Rena Spallings is the artist, and it says active 2004, not like board something, because this is really a collective of artists. And these collective of artists got together in 2004 and opened their own gallery. They could control their shows and how things are sold. But they are all anonymous. And I mean, the owners aren't, but the people that are sort of part of it, like for example here, these were all painted by different artists, but it's unknown who painted them. And each one is a dealer, and the photo it was not like a sit-down portrait. It was actually from like a gossip column or page 6, so they're not really that flattering of all these dealers. So this work here, I was just thinking, by Ricky Albende, done in 2009. First of all, this is an American artist, and we've seen actually just very, only because of the show, it includes works from European artists, and it's traveling to the Centre Pompidou after this. But usually, of course, it's just all American artists here in the museum. And I just wanted to point out, Ricky Albenda, he was born in Brooklyn. So on the wall text now, since the new museum is open, the artist's birthplace is listed on the wall text too, to really show how representative the American artist is. So here, Ricky Albenda, this painting, I was just thinking. So the collector said this was one of their favorite paintings. And they really wanted to include it in the exhibition. But the curators didn't really know this artist very well. They weren't sure what context to put it in or how to present it. So the collectors asked them to Skype with the artist and talk with the artist. So they had a Skype interview and they talked. And the curators decided they, of course, would want to keep it in the exhibition. But, that's just sort of a little example of how the collectors give exposure to young artists, emerging artists. Here they're getting them in contact with the curators here at the Whitney Museum. It's sort of the idea of supporting emerging artists, which is really just the same mission as this museum. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, that she was, had all this money, but she had a little place down in Greenwich Village, a studio where she got to know all the artists at the time, and she collected those artists at the time, and that's what started this whole museum. So this painting here, like I said, the collectors just loved it. They said there was something, the size is sort of like a picture window, and it's sort of this sort of airy ambience to it. And the words, I was just thinking. It's just, they said, really represents their feeling about collecting. That's what it's all about. It's not just looking at a pretty picture or something. It's just like, talk to artists, it just makes you really think. It's really invigorating. And Ethan Allen was saying that he's just always learning from the artists. It's just like the experience of collecting is all about learning, and it's being exposed to this. And so this really means a lot to them. And actually, this painting was mentioned in the last paragraph of the review of this exhibition in the New York Times, Roberta Smith's review, saying how this, I was just thinking, just really represents sort of this approach to contemporary art. That's what makes it so exciting. It is because you walk in and you have to start thinking about stuff. It's really stimulating. And so they were really happy, the collectors, that this got such a nice spot. So here we have a work by Cheney Thompson. And the collectors were saying how this is their next generation. That you just wonder, Cheney Thompson might get a 40-year retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art, like Gober. So, but he's sort of mid-career artist now. So the title of this, "The production of an unevenly distributed surplus results from the facticity of format and ground." And so Thompson is a very analytical and mathematical artist. He did his undergrad at the School of Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and he did his graduate work at the Harvard Extension School, which is actually at MIT in the School of Architecture. So a very mathematical approach. And what he did here to create this piece on linen is that he took a piece of linen and he looked under the microscope at it and just went down, 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 down until he saw what he thought would make an interesting pattern for a painting. And this is what it is. It's down, I'm not sure what the magnification is, but this is what linen would look like, going magnified. And it's also sort of funny about being a riff on the flatness of painting. You know, there's a whole thing, reviewer Clement Greenberg, just like a painting needs to be flat. So of course artists make a joke, okay, they just do their painting right on the gallery wall or whatever, but this is sort of another riff on the flatness of going right down to the material of the canvas or the linen here. And what's interesting is, well, first of all, you can see it's very mathematical. He's on graphite here. He's lined it up, XO, XO, and to make sure everything's perfectly lined up. And he's weaving. It's warp and woof. Is that what it is for weaving? Warp and woof. His painting is warp and woof. You can see this. He just so carefully does this. So this is like a lattice here with painting here. And this oil paint is just so sort of luscious that the oil is seeping out into the linen, which just makes just such a really beautiful painting here. Sort of
exhibition space in the new building of the Whitney Museum of American Art that opened here downtown 6 months ago. And I mentioned the size of the gallery that we're in because this exhibition, this retrospective of American artist Fred Stella, could not have happened in the old building simply because of the sheer scale of his work. We're talking about a monumental gallery for a monumental artist. And Stella is not only monumental in the scale of his work, which I think is something you can immediately see from the works that we're standing in front of here, but also in the scale of his career. Because we're talking about an artist who began working at the age of 23, almost immediately found success in the art world, which I find incredibly annoying. That was 1958, and he's still working today in 2016. And in that time, Stella has made more than 3,000 works of art that fall into about 60 different series. He's an artist who's very interested in the idea of the series, in taking a single idea and spinning it out to completion. And in this exhibition today, we have only about 100 works of art that fall into 25 series. And of course, in this 45-minute tour, we're unfortunately not going to be able to look at everything. But it is my intention to give a representative sampling of this vast career, and it is also my hope that by the end of the tour, we will be on the same page in believing that this early artwork and this later one were actually made by the same artist. Because I understand that at first glance, you might think that these belong to two completely different bodies of work. And indeed, what we're seeing here are two works of art that fall at the two poles of Stella's career. The early Stella, the so-called minimalist, and the later Stella, the self-described maximalist. But as different as these two works of art are, I actually think that they have just as much, if not more, in common than they do that sets them apart. So let's begin with some of the differences. You have here this earlier work from 1974 that shows you Stella's early concerns as a painter. You have very rigid sense of geometry. You see that the only shape we have here is a square. The only angle we have is a right angle. There's absolutely no overlapping. There's a very straightforward, flat sense of space. Stella is an artist who is obsessed with the idea of abstraction in painting. And what that means, first and foremost for this early work, is no sense of illusion. That means you're not going to see any recognizable objects. You're not going to see any sense of perspective. You're not going to see any recession into space. You're not looking into a window. You're looking at a flat surface. And in this painting, he maintains that with this very rigid rigid set of geometry that doesn't interlock or overlap at all. We also have a very austere color palette here. We have just black, white, and gray. And you also notice that the shapes that are on the canvas are also coincident with the canvas themselves. So he's using the shape of the canvas to determine the pattern that he's making on the canvas itself. At the same time, I think you do have a sense of motion in this work. Stella's an artist who's always concerned with getting an idea of dynamism in a still object. So you're looking at a painting, it's not a film, it's not something that's moving around, and you still have a sense, almost of vibration in this painting. A colleague of mine likes to describe this particular work as like a trampoline for your eyes. I think that's a great description for how it works. On the other hand, we have this work from 1999, in which all of those early concerns seem to have been thrown out the window. We have a complete profusion of shapes. Gone are those right angles. You have every different sort of shape you can imagine. You have every imaginable color. And instead of being very neatly separated, they're all on top of each other. They're all mixed together. You have different mediums. You no longer even have that sense of flatness because you have a kind of collage-like layering in this work where you see shapes and colors and materials that are layered on top of each other. No longer are the shapes coincident with the canvas. They seem to run around the whole canvas itself. And yet, as I said, this painting is actually a direct outgrowth of those early concerns that we've already discussed in this earlier one from 1974. And what I mean by that is, first of all, that sense of abstraction. Pushing abstract painting to its absolute limits. That's something that Stella is still working on. And he's still very concerned with geometric structure. It's just that those structures have gotten a lot more complicated. If you look at some of the shapes in this painting, you'll notice that they resemble the kind of mathematical structures that you might see on the computer of an advanced person doing calculus or geometry, these kinds of shapes that describe advanced mathematical equations. So we're still looking at geometry, just more complicated geometry. And you'll also see, absolutely, I think, a sense of movement. There's almost so much motion in this work that your eye doesn't have a chance to rest. It's constantly spinning around. So we can see, I'm not denying it, that there are major differences between these two pieces, but they do grow out of the same set of concerns, that sense of structure in abstract painting, that idea of dynamic motion and stillness, and color, space, and form constantly evolving in those contexts. Those are things we're going to see again and again and again. And they all come out of the very first mature body of work that Stella starts in 1958, which we're going to see in the next year.
That was one of my favorite novellas in German class.
The short answer is he likes it too.
Okay, right on.
So we're standing here in front of one of Frank Stella's black paintings. And these are, as I said, really the first mature body of work that he starts doing when he moves to New York City after graduating Princeton University in 1958, where, by the way, he studied history, not art. And that's going to come back in his work as well. And Stella starts experimenting with painting, and in 1959, he hits on this form. Something entirely new in painting that immediately rocketed him to recognition in the art world. And I think even without knowing a lot of the history of what was going on in New York at that time, you can see why these paintings were considered something so new, something so startling, and even why they were called the tombstone of painting. Because you're seeing here a work that it's not just emptied of representation of content. It's not only that there isn't any recognizable object in this work, it's also emptied of any sense of gesture, any sense of personality, any sense of accident or serendipity. It's emptied, in fact, of almost everything that we tend to associate with painting. So, again, Stella is, right from the beginning, pushing abstract painting to its absolute limits. And what that means in these early works is taking as much out of it as possible. And you can see, in fact, exactly the process that he followed to make this painting. He went to the hardware store. He's not using fine art materials. He goes to the hardware store and buys a big bucket of black house paint. He buys a 2.5-inch house painter's brush. And then what he does is divide his canvas in half, and then he just starts painting stripes. They're exactly 2.5 inches wide. When he finishes this one, he moves the brush over by 1/4 of an inch, so that's why you get these, what look like stripes of white. They're actually strips of raw canvas on the painting. And then he just keeps going until he's filled in the whole thing. Absolutely logical, absolutely rigid, and no sense of surprise. He knows what the painting is going to look like before he starts it. He knows exactly what he's going to do, and he knows exactly when the painting is finished. And this radicality has very much to do with what Stella finds when he moves to New York in 1958. Because in 1958, the art world was very much still in thrall of the painting movement that had come before, which was abstract expression. So if you're all familiar with this movement, if you're familiar with the figure of Jackson Pollock, and you know we're talking about an art movement that is all about abstraction, but all about gesture in abstraction. Pollock, who is the leader of abstract expressionism, was known for putting raw canvas on the floor of his studio and throwing and dripping and dropping paint directly onto the canvas. So you have a completely abstract work, but you have one that was meant to be a kind of psychological outpouring of the artist's state of mind, a sense that he's putting his interior state onto the canvas, very gestural, very personal, very physical. It's a unique work of art. It can't be repeated. The artist has no idea what it's going to look like when he starts. And he also very famously never knew exactly when he was finished. This is something that abstract expressionist artists talk about all the time at the bars. How do I know when the painting's done? And this was a real problem for Stella. Not because he didn't admire Jackson Pollock, but because he admired him so much that he had to answer the question for himself of what to do now. How can you take abstract painting further than it had already gone? How can you get more abstract than drops of paint on a canvas? And his answer about what to do next was to remove that sense of gesture and personality from painting and get this very stripped down, very essential, very logical painting that you have before you. Again, Stella has no problem knowing when he's done the painting. It's pretty obvious for him. He's also really interested in an idea of materiality in painting. I mentioned that he's interested in flatness, he's interested in a lack of representation, a lack of illusion. And part of what that means is reminding the audience that you're not just looking at a picture, you're looking at an object. You're looking at something that's made out of stuff. It's made out of paint and canvas and a wooden frame. Stella's really reminding us in all of his works that this is not just a picture, but a thing. He does that in a couple of ways. First of all, by those raw strips of canvas that show you that this is made out of something. It's kind of like seeing the man behind the curtain here. And he also does it by making his paintings unusually thick. Normally a painting projects out from the wall 1/2 inch, maybe 1.5 inches. These are 2.5-inch thick stretcher bars he's using. So the painting is really pushing out and occupying the same space that you do in the gallery, really becoming an object in the world and not just a picture to look at. And it's not a coincidence that it's 2.5 inches wide, because of course that's the same width that he's using with his paintbrush. So again, everything follows logically. Everything's part of the same system here. But all that said, Stella was not completely satisfied with these paintings, because I mentioned that he's obsessed with this idea of flatness. He doesn't want there to be any illusion of space at all. But I think you'll see that when you look at this painting, it's possible to imagine that you're looking down 2 tunnels, right? You can almost see you're looking into a dark space that's receding into the background. Stella was not okay with that at all. And in fact, he vowed that he would deal with that problem in the next series of paintings that we're going to be looking at. To the left at one of Frank Stella's aluminum paintings. And this is a series that he begins in 1960, the following year after the black paintings that we just looked at. And I mentioned that these paintings were, in a way, an answer to the problem of how to get rid of space in the work, how to make a work that was completely flat, no sense of illusion. And he comes up with actually a very simple and kind of brilliant solution to that problem. He goes back to the hardware store, and instead of choosing that sort of matte black paint, he chooses shiny aluminum paint, the kind of paint that you're going to be using on a radiator, the kind of paint that you may be familiar with in old New York City buildings. Because by choosing metallic paint, he's choosing something that's literally reflective, that's literally going to bounce your eye off of the painting and make you know that you're looking at something totally flat. And we'll see immediately that that's not the only innovation that he's coming up with in this aluminum painting series. He's also thinking about that idea of movement. We talked early on about that sense of dynamic motion. And what Stella said he wanted to do with the series was to put a jog in his paintings. And what he means by that is that little notch, that little edge that you get in the lines and those stripes that we've seen from the very beginning. He felt that gave, and I think you'll agree, more of a kind of dynamic sensibility to these works. But again, he has a problem, because when he elaborates this pattern and takes it to its logical conclusion, he finds that he has little bits left over that don't fit anymore. And that's no good, because he wants the stripes on the canvas to be completely coincident with the shape of the canvas. So what does he do with these leftover pieces? He's talking to an artist friend of his about this problem, and the friend says, well, why don't you just get rid of them? So that's exactly what he did. He starts cutting pieces out of the canvas in order to make the stripes completely coincident with the shape of the canvas itself. But already here we're seeing that every time Frank Stella takes a step deeper into painting, every time he tries to push abstract painting even further, he also finds himself getting a little bit further away from it. Because when we start to see these notches, we might start to think that we're looking at something almost more like a sculpture than a painting. And we're going to see that over and over and over again, that Stella's always taking one step forward and one step back. And in fact, in his next series of paintings, the following year, he takes that idea even further, and you'll see to your right here his copper paintings of the next year. So these are works that are still done with metallic paint. He's going back to the hardware store and getting copper paint, and I think you can really see that sense of reflection in these works. You can see how the paint changes as you move your eye around. And of course you can also see that he's taking that idea of the shaped canvas to a new extreme. He's completely abandoned the idea that a painting should be a square or a rectangle on the wall, and really making something that's becoming sculpture. And when his canvases get even more shaped and even larger, we're going to see that that sense of sculpture even becomes something like architecture. And that's what it is. So we just looked at paintings from 1960 and 61. Now we're in front of a painting from 1967, so a few years later. But I think all of you are already familiar enough with Stella's early work to recognize a number of characteristics in these paintings. You're able to see those very flat stripes of color that have no texture at all on the surface of the canvas. You're seeing those raw strips of canvas that we've seen from the very earliest black paintings. And you're also seeing that idea of the shaped canvas that we're familiar with too, from the aluminum and the copper paintings. But of course there are some significant differences here as well. First of all, he's introducing the curve for the first time. Now we're still looking at a rather mathematical curve. You can probably see why Stella referred to this series as his protractor paintings. But these curves, I think, are introducing a kind of new sensual element that we haven't seen in the earlier work, and it's going to get even more pronounced later on. It also introduces, for the first time, a sense of overlap. You'll notice there are areas in this painting where the stripes are on top of each other. So that idea of total flatness is starting to shift and change a little bit. He's becoming more interested in playing around with the depiction of space. And then, of course, there is this overwhelming, fabulous, fluorescent use of color. It's very surprising from the guy who got famous making black paintings. And you can see that he's really playing with the idea of color, seeing how different colors change the effect of the work. Because in fact, Stella said, despite the evidence you have before your eyes, that he's not a color guy. He says, I'm a structure guy. Structure is what I'm good at, and structure is the basis of everything I do. I think we've actually seen that so far. We've seen how he uses structure, how he sets up a canvas and then has the stripes follow the shape of that canvas, how he sets out a logical chain of activity that he follows through the end. We've seen that structure manifest itself in his painting so far. And what he said is that when you have a really strong structure, you're able to do, and this is a quote, really freaky things with color. So for him, color is a direct outgrowth of structure. He's using it in a structural way here. He's using it to change the way that the shapes form together. We're going to see that in an even stronger way when we move into the 70s. So I'd like to talk about these two paintings to my right and left, so feel free to arrange yourself wherever you can find a spot. So we just looked at a work from 1967. Now we're a few years later in 1973, and we can see that that idea of painting is getting a little bit stretched, right? So we're still seeing something on the wall. It's still more or less rectangular, but he's no longer using paint on canvas. He's using enamel on metal, right? We have a physical metal construction. And we're not just looking at overlapping lines anymore. We are looking at physical space that is very much protruding out into the gallery and becoming part of the objects in the room with us. And with this series, Stella said that he really wanted to think about color as a structural element. He wanted to find a way to see if color could completely determine what you see in a work of art. And that may sound a little bit obscure, but I think you'll actually understand what he means when you realize that these two pieces are made of the exact same metal structure, and the only thing that's different is the color that he's using. And if you didn't notice that immediately, I think it's just because he's actually quite adept at using color to get very different visual effects. So for example, what you see here is a large field of this pink reddish hue that really kind of seems to jut out and swim before your eye. That warm red color really comes forward. Whereas in the other work, that same piece of metal is covered in a dark blue. It really falls backward a little bit. It seems to be further back in the distance from this pink one. So you can see that color really can be a structural element. It really can have as much to do with how you see a work as its physical components and the sense of space that he's using. Now, as far away as we're getting in a certain sense from painting, I mentioned that every time Stella takes a step forward into painting, he sort of takes a step back. But the opposite is true as well. Every time he seems to move away from the conventions of painting, he takes another step forward in a sense. And here he's doing that with the use of gesture. That sense of gesture that he had completely gotten rid of in his early work is now back with a vengeance. And you can see in these pieces that he's taken a very thick oil crayon and really scribbled on the surface of these works, really giving a sense of the artist's hand, almost giving an idea of that abstract expressionist kind of Jackson Pollock-like idea of gesture that we didn't see at all. So as I said, he's removing certain things from painting, but he's also bringing certain things back. And that sense of that gesture, that scribbled idea of the artist's hand being present in the work, is going to be magnified and multiplied quite a bit when we move a few years later, and I'd like to talk about the work that's just on this wall. So we're going now from 1973 to 1976. And we're seeing some similarities, but also, of course, some differences here. So you'll recognize that sense of the mark of the artist's hand, that now seems to have been almost magnified and spread all over the black background. That sense of the really large gesture, like a giant has taken a giant paintbrush from this piece. And you'll notice that we have many different kinds of marks now. You have thin lines and thick ones, you have scribbles, and you also have another sense of color that we didn't have before. Because you'll notice that even with all the bright colors that we looked at in the earlier works, they all have the same sheen to them. They're all matte. Because Stella's really only interested in exploring the color itself. But now here, he's turned his attention to all different kinds of surfaces in color, which is why you have this fluorescent matte green with orange on top, as well as this very shiny, almost nail polish like purple square. And then you have all different kinds of colors and shades mixed in together. And you also have glitter. And I think the glitter is actually doing a few different things in this work. On the one hand, it's been pointed out that this is a work from the 70s, so it's possible that we're seeing the influence of disco. It's not impossible. And I think the glitter is actually kind of a brilliant way of giving that sense of movement to this piece. We talked from the beginning of the idea of movement in stillness. And glitter is, of course, a totally still substance that only comes to life when you move around. You have to actually turn your head, you have to physically move around this painting in order to see the glitter move and do its thing. So he's adding a new form of movement to this piece. And it also gives, I think, a kind of sense of Baroque decoration, which may also relate to these arabesque or fleur-de-lis-like shapes that we see. So we had that sense of the curve when we were looking at the protractor series, but this is something beyond that. We seem to have left simple geometry behind, and we have almost a sense of Baroque decoration here. That's actually not a coincidence, because believe it or not, Stella's very much thinking about Baroque painting when he's working on this series. I mentioned that he studied history, and art history is something that comes up again and again in his work. What I mean by the fact that he's looking at Baroque painting is that he's really looking at the Baroque idea of space. So if you think about space in a classical Renaissance painting, what you're looking at is a window with a single perspective. You imagine yourself looking at a painting of a road going off into the distance, and there's only one correct place to stand. You have to stand in one spot to get the illusion just right. And the innovation of Baroque painting is to change that idea completely so that the painting now becomes something with 180 degrees of perspective. Instead of standing in one place, you're supposed to move all around the painting and look at it from every angle. And of course, that's exactly what Stella wants you to do in this work. He wants you to experience it from every side. He wants you to see the glitter move. And he wants you to see how these different forms change their relationships to each other as you move around the painting. There's another element of this work. I think as different as it is in many ways from things that we've seen so far, there are points of continuity beyond that idea of abstraction, beyond that idea of space and rhythm. You'll remember that in his earliest paintings, Stella always included those strips of raw canvas because he wanted to show the materiality. He wanted to show that you're looking at an object, and he wanted you not to be fooled by the sense of illusion. And you'll notice here that even though he's no longer working in canvas, now that he's working with this very smooth, refined metal, we're looking at metal objects attached to this work. And even though each surface is completely covered in a completely smooth and perfect way, he always keeps the edges raw. And you'll notice that when you get up close to this painting. Every single one of these shapes has a raw metal edge exactly like it came from the factory. He's always interested in showing you the materiality of the work, showing you what it's made of, and sort of giving you that glimpse behind the curtain, the materiality of this, the sense of the raw stripe. That's actually going to recur throughout his work, even as his other concerns start to evolve. Now, as we're looking at this piece that seems to be almost tumbling off the wall onto us, it's worth asking the question of whether we're still looking at a painting or whether we've moved into the realm of sculpture. And Stella considers that almost everything in this exhibition is really a painting. Even though we're seeing a lot of sense of space here, we're seeing things that may very well recall sculpture to us. But to me, really, the interesting question isn't so much whether it's yes or no, or right or wrong, but really why, or what do we get out of it? What is gained if we decide to take Stella's word for it, if we decide to run with it and say that this is a painting and not a sculpture? And I think what we gain is a sense of that tradition of sculpture, that tradition of painting that Stella is working with, and all those concerns of painting that he's speaking about. Because sculpture is an object of three dimensions. It's an object about space. It's an object of a physical form that occupies exactly the same kind of spatial reality as the human body. And Stella is interested in space here, but he's interested in a kind of flatness of space. He's interested in these forms that, despite their dimensionality, are totally flat. He's interested in the kind of texture and the kind of mark making that's very much associated with the tradition of painting. These are all things that would still be in the work if we thought of it as a sculpture, but they come very much more to the fore when we know that this is a painting. It gives us a clue as to what the important elements are in this work. So I think the answer is, if we're willing to sort of suspend our disbelief and see this as a painting, we have a much richer experience of the work. We get more out of it. There's more to see. And as much as I'm saying that in front of this work, I should give the disclaimer that the reason I'm making this argument to you now is that we're about to look at a work that's going to test our ideas of painting more than anything we've seen so far. So we just looked at a work from 1976, and now here we are in 1989, so more than 10 years later. And Stella has continued along those lines of development that we've seen so far. So admittedly, we're no longer looking at a square form on the wall. It's still attached to the wall, so you gotta give me that. We're looking at a shape that almost seems to have more out in space than it does on the wall. It's still attached, but it's no longer attached by a square. It's a completely irregular shape that seems to recall the forms of sculpture more than the forms of painting. And yet, I would argue, there's almost more painterly content in this work than anything we've seen so far. Because you'll notice that as three-dimensional as it is, it also has more kinds of mark making, more kinds of painting than anything we've seen. You have the smooth enamel in front with these very recognizable brush strokes in blue and black on top of the white. You have what looks like sponge painting and spray paint along the edges. You have very smooth lines and you have rough ones. You have as many kinds of mark making as the artist himself. And on top of all that, we have a form out in front. It's a metal form, but it seems to physically recall the shape of a paintbrush, the shape that a paintbrush makes on a canvas or on a surface. So it's almost like he's giving us an emblem of painting in this work that's getting more sophisticated. So as I said, there's always that push-pull between getting deeper into painting and pulling back into other mediums. It's also worth noting that this work is from Stella's Moby Dick series. He decided that he was going to make one work of art for every chapter in Moby Dick. And if you're laughing at that, it's because you know that Moby Dick has 135 chapters. But I think that gives us a clue into Stella's working process. Because I think the idea of the 135 chapters is just another structure for him. It's another armature on which he can hang his ideas and work through the iterations of his ideas, just the same way he was doing with that structural idea of color. But the fact that this is based on Moby Dick, I think changes the way we look at this piece. We start seeing things that we might not see. You'll see a lot of white in the Moby Dick series, which may remind us of the white skin of the whale. And you'll also see a lot of water forms, a lot of things that look like waves or sea foam, blue and white and black. And this is maybe a little bit surprising in the work of an artist who is so totally committed himself to abstraction. And yet, when I look at this form in front, which looks so much like a wave or the sea spray, especially with that white and black and blue that you see, I'm also reminded that water itself doesn't have a fixed form, that it's constantly taking new shapes and new forms in nature. So in a sense, I think Stella is suggesting to us that natural representation and abstraction aren't necessarily always as far apart as they may seem, that these things are actually connected, and he's bringing them closer to us in this Moby Dick series. Now, Stella, as you've seen, has certainly evolved his methods over time, from paint on canvas to the shaped canvases to the objects in metal that jut out into the gallery that we've been seeing. And next we're going to go a few decades further and look at a work of art that you can see some of the great craftsmen doesn't need to be. Wow. This has got to be a sculpture. So we're looking here at a work from 2009. This is one of the most recent works in the exhibition. And we're looking at something that is probably pushing our idea of painting even further than it's been so far.
Wee bit.
However, I am indebted to point out that this work is still attached to the wall. It is only attached in two places, but it is still attached to the wall here. And it's still a painted object. But it has a very different kind of paint structure, I think you'll notice. We don't have that kind of rough sense of different kinds of texture, of sponge paint, of spray paint, of different kinds of mark making. You have very, very smooth paint here. In fact, Stella is using spray paint. He's using automotive enamel, the kind of very smooth, shiny paint that you use to paint a car. You also notice that the colors flow very smoothly into one another. Very much complements the smoothness of the form that you have before you, this almost spinning kind of rotating form. It's actually inspired by a piece of music. This is from Stella's Scarlatti K series, which was inspired by the harpsichord compositions of the 18th century composer Domenico Scarlatti. And music is, in a sense, I think, a very natural subject for Stella. He once said, you know, music doesn't have to defend its abstraction, pointing out the fact that we take abstraction quite naturally in music, but we're often demanding representation from our visual art. So it's very natural that he would be interested in this subject. I think it's also a good subject for him because it allows him to give that wonderful sense of moving, that dynamic motion of a piece of music that picks you up and kind of spins you around before dropping you off somewhere else. That's what we're literally seeing here in this very smooth form, this looping, rounded form that goes so well with the paint. And it almost seems to me that what we're seeing here is a smooth, kind of virtual reality form, something that looks like it came from a computer screen, that's so full of movement and life that it has to spin off the screen, off the wall, and inhabit three-dimensional space with us. It's not actually a coincidence that this work, which is so much smoother and almost more virtual reality looking everything we've seen so far, because it's actually made with digital technology. This, what you're looking at, is actually a gigantic 3D print. Stella was one of the first artists to adopt 3D printing technology in the 1990s when it was much less sophisticated. In fact, you can see an example of that to your left here. And you can immediately see that this work allows him to do much more sophisticated things with the medium. His process for this was to begin with a maquette in his studio with a model. as he did for many of these later works. He would start by putting together different objects, pieces of metal, pieces of cardboard, bits and pieces left over from other projects. And once he had a satisfactory model, he would scan it into a computer and continue playing with it and changing it and altering it. And when he finally had the shape he wanted, he would have it digitally manufactured, which is to say he would have a gigantic 3D print made. And then he would paint it in his studio with this very smooth paint that I think absolutely complements that kind of virtual computer-like quality of the form. And then, of course, he's adding these raw metal poles. And I think that's a very significant element of this work. Not only because it provides a great sense of contrast, that very kind of smooth, virtual shape with these very rough metal poles. They're right from the manufacturer. You can see all the marks and dings on them. You can see the manufacturer's numbers in some place. And I think what we're seeing in these poles is not only a sense of contrast, and not only a way of attaching the work to the wall, but we're also seeing that raw stripe that we saw from the very earliest works, that sense of materiality, even in something made by a computer. That sense of the raw materiality that he always wants to include in his pieces, and he always includes throughout his entire career. So as I mentioned, this is one of the latest works in the show, one of the most recent works. But if you'll follow me into the next gallery, I'd like to look at a slightly earlier piece that I think will sum up a lot of the ideas. So the wait was worth it because we have finally arrived at a work of art that Frank Stella identifies as a sculpture. This is a piece from 1990. It's called The Raft of the Medusa. But even though this is a freestanding object, we can see that it's not completely freestanding, because even though it's not hanging on a wall, it's still hanging on an armature. So even when he's moving, admittedly, into the realm of sculpture, Stella is still interested in problems of painting. He's still interested in that idea of a frontal orientation, something that hangs from the center rather than coming up from the floor. And that's, in this piece, not at all a coincidence, because this work is a direct response to a painting that was made in 1818. I mentioned that it's called The Raft of the Medusa, and that's also the name of a very important French Romantic painting by the artist Théodore Géricault. This was a painting that was based on a contemporary event. There was a horrible shipwreck in which most of the sailors were killed. And the survivors were able to cobble together a raft from the debris of the ship, the Medusa. They took little pieces of wood, objects that they had, bits of clothing to tie everything together. And a few of the survivors managed to make it back to France. And you can imagine that this very dramatic and very tragic story made headlines. It was an object of great discussion in France. And Géricault immortalized this event in a fantastic painting, an enormous painting for the time, which is, I think, not coincidental that Stella was inspired by something that was very large. And of course, however, if we're looking at a work by Frank Stella, the dedicated abstractionist, even if it's based on a representational painting, that doesn't mean we should be looking for sailors and rafts and ocean life here, right? He's not thinking about the objects in the painting, he's thinking about its formal qualities. And in fact, if you ever have had a chance to see The Raft of the Medusa, or if you happen to look it up on your phone, you'll immediately notice that there's a very strong central triangular composition, that the raft of the title and the figures on it in various states of exhaustion and despair make almost a kind of pyramidal shape that dominates the whole painting. And that's exactly what we're seeing here, that very strong sense of composition that Stella is learning from his art historical forebears. And even though we're not seeing people, we're not seeing a raft, we do very much have that sense of an object cobbled together. Because very much in the same way, Stella made this work from things in his studio that were lying around. He took pieces of metal, pieces of wire, all kinds of different metal objects. The more you look at this work, the more different kinds of bits and pieces you'll see. And then to unite them all together, he poured liquid aluminum over the whole thing. The aluminum, of course, immediately hardened, and then he took individual bits and mounted them into what looks like almost a swirling storm of these shapes. We have the sense that the aluminum isn't frozen, but rather that it's still in motion, that it's about to leap out at us, that it's still liquid. And I think there can be almost no better example of frozen motion in Stella's work. He's still very much interested in the idea of the dynamic motion in it. completely still artwork. However, we're very far away from that highly controlled, logical sensibility, that sense that he knows exactly what the shape is going to look like before he starts. Because of course, when you're dealing with something like that, in that very Jackson Pollock kind of method of throwing this liquid material, you're going to have total chaos. You're not going to know what you're going to get at the end. So Stella's ideas have clearly evolved. And yet at the same time, we have to keep in mind that all of this is anchored, both figuratively and literally, by the highly stable geometric armature behind it. You'll notice we've got all right angles in that steel support, and you'll also notice that he's chosen a raw-looking weathered steel that gives a very strong visual contrast, geometric as well as textural, to this explosion of chaotic form in front. So this is another fine example, I think, of Stella moving forward with his ideas, bringing gesture and chaos and new sensibilities into his work, while always remaining true to that sense of structure, that sense of order that underpins everything he does. So I think now, ending with this work, I hope that you'll maybe by now agree with me that the first two works we looked at were actually by the same artist. And I thank you very much for listening today. I have a lot of cough drops. Thank you. Oh, thank you so much.
To 33rd Street. The next stop is Newport.
Okay, so that one I know the answer to.
Yeah.
So the screen.
Oh, that's great.
Breaking any speed records.